but I've talked to scores and scores of scientists, and I've read hundreds of scientific articles in this area. And as I say, I've been to a lot of conferences and did a lot of reporting. So those are my bona fides, as it were. Yeah, there we are. We'll skip over that since we've already now seen that. Well, one of the things, all right, they didn't address it in the show, but one of the questions is, well, is organic food nutritionally better? And it just happens that there was probably the most comprehensive systematic report was done for the British Food Standards Agency administration just this past summer. It was a review of 55,000 articles on nutrition. They selected the ones that were peer-reviewed journals, which showed that were in fact comparing conventional with organic produce and so forth. And what they found out of the 162 peer-reviewed articles that were valid in their opinion, they tell you the standard for that, and this was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. There's no evidence of a difference in nutrient quality between organically and conventionally produced foodstuffs. And this has been replicated many times before. The study done by the Danish Organic Agency also tried to do a feeding study where they were looking to see if there was any nutritional difference by feeding mice for 2 years, organic versus conventional, and they could find absolutely no differences in that particular study. And again, there aren't any differences. So you're not getting better nutrition. But we could talk about pesticides in a little bit. What about, is it better for the soil? Is it better for farming? Is it a better way to raise crops? Is it and you heard one of the people in the Pentateuch say it's a moral way to behave. Well, the answer is, well, maybe in a certain sense, but probably not. Again and again, what you find is that what happens with, and I won't read these to you, you're capable of reading, I understand at the University of Chicago, but the fact of the matter is that organic production is not nearly as productive as conventional production, and not nearly as productive as biotech crop production as well. You use more land. You use more land because you have to leave some of it fallow part of the time, or you have to raise manure crops on it to produce nitrogen, which will take it out of food production so that you can then provide the nitrogen for the food, that kind of thing. And basically what you find, and this one study at the top here, Soil Fertility, Biodiversity, and Organic Farming, is a 21-year study done by Swiss researchers for 21 years, raising wheat and potatoes and so forth, side by side, using the two different kinds of production techniques, and they found it only 20% smaller. But if you go into the actual details of their study, you would find it's considerably smaller than that. But this was the one where they were trying their best to make organic as productive as conventional, and they couldn't do it for 21 years. So basically what you would have to do, if you're trying to save nature, I would suggest to you is what you want to do is to make your farming as intensive as possible, to raise as much food on as little land as possible over time. One way to think about it is the following. If we were still raising food at the same level of productivity, never mind organic, at the same level of productivity we were raising food in 1950, today, if we're trying to raise food in that productivity level to feed the world's current population, you would have to have an extra farmland area the size of North America to do it. This would be in addition to all the farmland we currently use. In other words, over the last 50 years, we would have had to chop down literally almost all the forest that would be left on the planet in order to feed the world's people. And even then, that land would not be nearly arable enough to do it. So in other words, it would be impossible to do. Now, what has happened, and there's a wonderful study done by Rockefeller University. I understand that they were also founded by a certain person who had something to do with this place. Jesse Oswald and his colleagues at the Human Environment Group, unit actually, what they've done was just a quick analysis where they're thinking, well, if we could get the average farmer, the average farmer in the world to the same level of productivity as the average American farmer today, what would happen? And what they discover is that you could feed 10 billion people using half the farmland we currently use on the planet today. In other words, you could, this doesn't take any extraordinary new technologies. These are using the seeds we have now and the technologies we have now. If you could, magically, and there are reasons that there are barriers to that, which we could get into, that we could actually feed the world using our current food technologies. In fact, more than feed the world, feed them 10 billion people at the same level of calories that we Americans currently enjoy. So, if you want to save the world, I don't think organic is the way to go. Why am I doing this wrong? There, oops. Back. Sorry. I'm not used to this computer. And John Ilmsley, who is an agricultural researcher at Cambridge University, a biochemist, I think is correct when he says the greatest catastrophe the human race would face this century is not global warming, but a global conversion to organic farming. An estimated 2 billion people would perish. And part of the calculation he's coming up when he says this is the following. Vaclav Smil, who's an absolutely genius guy at the University of Saskatchewan, and he wrote a book called Enriching the Earth, was talking about the Haber-Bosch process. I don't know if many of you know this, right?
I was not aware that organic farming didn't use artificial fertilizer.
They don't. It is forbidden entirely. It's completely crazy. Now, I'm sorry, organic farming, you're not allowed to use any synthetic inputs. Our plant, of course, cannot tell where the nitrogen comes from, if it's from the Haber-Bosch process or not, but that's just part of the rule. I mean, to give you a little bit of the history of organic farming, it came out of, among other people, a guy called a German who called himself an anthroposophist named Rudolf Steiner. And I'm sorry, this was the 1920s, you made up stuff like that. And he came up with a system that he calls biodynamic, which eventually morphed into what we call organic. And he was convinced that industrial inputs were somehow destroying our bodily fluids, and we have to get over that. And among many other practices that he recommended, for example, is that to increase the power of your fertilizer, you would stuff cow horns with manure and bury them at the full of the moon for 2 months, and then take them up at the new moon, and the fertilizer would be better, and you could then use it. I mean, these are the kinds of stuff you could go back in the history of the organic movement and find, I mean, real wackiness. There's still some wackiness, but among those things, you're not allowed to use, quote, artificial or synthetic inputs like nitrogen in this particular case. But speaking of nitrogen, going back to the Vaclav Smil point, is that something like 40% of all of the nitrogen fertilizer, how should I put it? A better way to put it, I think Vaclav Smil put it this way, more interestingly, is that 40% of the nitrogen atoms that are in your body were derived from the Haber-Bosch process. And what would happen is that if we were to get rid of that extra fertilizer that we make using this process, 40%, 2 billion people would not be able to eat. We simply wouldn't be able to raise enough food because there wouldn't be enough fertilizer. And that's what Emsley is the point he's trying to make. So